Hey folks, welcome to Friendly Orbit, the podcast that draws us together no matter how far we fly. I'm Ceres. I'm here to give you a feel for a game called Draw Steel, and I'm joined by...
Tactically and cinematically out of your fantasy, it's there.
This week we're going to be talking about Draw Steel, a new game by MCDM. In fact, we have a mega 4-part series planned, which is pretty crazy and didn't exactly go as we were intending it to, but here we are. This episode we're going to be talking about Draw Steel, our just general feelings about it, talking about rules, and then we have a 3-parter playtest that we recorded in early January that we will be releasing after this. So, I don't know, Thea. Give us a funny button for the outro.
You know how I said tactically and cinematically and fantasy?
Mm-hmm.
I left out heroically because there's nothing heroic about what we are about to put our listeners through.
Ignition sequence start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff.
Alrighty, Thea. Let's talk about Draw Steel. I guess maybe I should just do a general intro on what it is and we'll start talking about our feelings about it.
Absolutely.
Alrighty. Draw Steel is a game made by MCDM. That is the company that Matt Colville, the D&D guy on YouTube, made.
The D&D guy, the one and only.
Yeah, you know him.
There are no others.
And if you don't know him, Google Matt Colville D&D, and then you can know him. You know what I mean? He's a game designer. He's worked on a lot of different games, but if you know him, you probably know him for being the guy on YouTube who does D&D. He's like one of the biggest D&D advice YouTube channels. Anyways, back a few years ago when the whole open gaming license debacle happened with Dungeons and Dragons, a lot of companies like MCDM that used to produce third-party content for 5th edition D&D decided that they wanted to not make content for D&D anymore because of the licensing issues involved in it, or the potential licensing issues that could arise. And so a lot of them decided to make their own game. Critical Role made, Darrington Press, but, the people at Critical Role made Daggerheart, which is not what we're talking about today. But the Dungeon Coach, who's another YouTube D&D guy, he made DC-20. And Matt Colville, well, him and his company, full of talented designers like James Introcaso and Jordy and Willie, made MCDM's game Draw Steel. So, when was the first time you heard about Draw Steel, Thea?
I have no idea, but it was probably somewhere in early 2024 when you told me about it.
Yeah, that would make sense.
That I cannot imagine that I ever heard about this game before you started telling me about it.
Yeah.
But I associate a lot of early 2024 with my master thesis and you telling me about all of these alternate D&D games. So I'm gonna bet.
There we go.
There.
Yeah, so for us, after the open gaming license, we were also kind of like, well, maybe we should check out some games that aren't D&D, expand our horizons a little bit. So I've been keeping tabs on a lot of these games developing because I'm very excited about them. By the way, one thing I do want to mention in this episode at some point, Draw Steel raised $4.6 million. So that's an insane amount of money. This is like a huge fucking deal, in my opinion. Third-party content doesn't raise that kind of money normally in the TTRPG
Can you imagine
space.
if like 3 million out of that is just one guy? Like a billionaire who's really just like one, one multi-millionaire or billionaire is really invested and is just like, I can afford this.
I have to admit, many of my if I was a billionaire fantasies go similarly to this.
Yeah, if I was a billionaire, I would use money to develop a game that I can play with my friends, and that's my fantasy, which you can
and,
already live basically.
and then I would give the rest of the money away. Yeah,
So
it's
you
not
just live
everyone
your
can
current life
not everyone has aspirations.
with a slightly better designed version of Dungeons and Dragons.
Thea, not everyone can have can dream as big as me. All right.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, you homebrewed our D&D so much that you probably already kind of have that.
I'll do it myself.
Yeah, exactly.
Grabs
So at this
Infinity Gauntlet.
point, yeah, god damn it. If you ever give away your billions, can you give them away from me? I have dreams that I'm not living right now.
I will honestly, if I had billions, I would definitely give you more than just a random person. Yeah, I feel like it'd be kind of weird if I just you have billions of dollars and you give it all away and you don't even give any to your friends.
Yeah, like buy me a house and then
Yeah, exactly.
whatever you do with the rest, it's fine. I
I'll
trust
buy you a house right next to mine, and I'm sure it won't affect our relationship in any way.
Yeah, you buy me a house and you buy me a butler who keeps tabs on me all the time to check if I play with other people.
Make sure you only play Draw Steal. All right. So yeah, let's talk about why D&D sucks sometimes. D&D sucks sometimes because it's a game that is designed in a somewhat uncoordinated way. There is not really one central design ethos to D&D beyond the sort of idea that this game needs to uphold the legacy brand, needs to fulfill the expectations that longtime players sort of have of the genre and of the game, while at the same time being as playable as possible.
That's
Which
kind
doesn't
of
really
it, right?
sound...
We're sort of like the game design keeps evolving to streamline and simplify things,
Yeah.
and then it keeps dragging around this corpse from the 70s that I
Yes.
just cannot get rid of. And so every
Yeah.
new design has to somehow work with the old stuff, with the old design.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely. So it's kind of like at first it doesn't sound that bad, but then imagine if like you're like trying to design high performance luxury cars and you have to fit them into a Model T Ford every single time. You know what I mean? So you got this great engine, but it doesn't quite fit into the Model T. So you gotta take a hammer to it and work in some dents so that it fits into this old design. And that can be frustrating at times. And I mean, what I personally see as artifacts of this kind of unstated design ethos of D&D are things like spell slots. Spell slots, the power level of a spell slot, and the ability to cast a certain spell are connected. In many other games, you have sort of mana, and then you have a mana spend limit, and the mana spend limit can increase without the amount of mana increasing. That's like one thing. Another one is the weapons table is a classic one, right? There's all these weapons, but a lot of them aren't usable, but they're classic D&D weapons. Another one is the whole system of attrition. D&D is a game that's about wearing down your resources. Same thing. Many games that don't have a mana system then have spells that only succeed when you roll above a certain number or something. But in generally, D&D spells just kind of work, and it's kind of like you can defeat anything 3 times a day, and then you're out of spell slots, and then you can't anymore. So it's kind of a game of attrition, which is often not very heroic, but with the history of being sort of a dungeon crawler, where you go into a dungeon and you got to decide when to turn around, it makes a lot of sense. But in the genre of heroic fantasy, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And the genre in like heroic fantasy and like movies and stuff like that, heroes tend to get better the more combat goes on, not worse, right? Like they're kind of warming up and building confidence or self-actualizing somehow. And so they tend to get stronger. They trust each other more. They build stronger bonds. They tend to get better over time, not worse. There's elements like that. There's elements like the gold, the fact that you can build a bastion is like a classic of D&D. The fact that gold is so important in D&D, that you need to technically track all your arrows, that you need to technically track all your rations, all your ropes. That comes all from like this dungeon survival horror-y sort of subsistence hex crawl kind of past. There was one where I was thinking about, the fact that you have to roll to hit and then you have to roll for damage, that's not one roll. That's a legacy thing, right? It used to be that a hit point was like whenever you hit, you deal 1 hit point. That's why it's a hit point. So you just kind of rolled to hit, and then, more nuance got built into that. So now it's the system where 35% of the time you miss your attack, you don't really do anything with your turn, and then, or you roll a crit, but then you roll low for damage, and then how does that really make sense? There's a lot of odd, weird corners. The spells as well. The spell selection is like, Find Familiar just replaces the best sneaking rogue in the party, and then with Knock, you don't need anybody to pick locks anymore. So all of a sudden, that you don't need anymore. There's like all sorts of spells that kind of, those are even low level spells. Like, think about like teleportation at higher level, True Resurrection, Polymorph, Wish. There's like setting and game breaking spells that are just kind of bowing to the legacy of D&D, that are probably things your players should not be able to do, like overcome any obstacle, travel anywhere without issue, rewrite the laws of reality. These are things that, like, generally, and one more example came to mind. Oh yeah,
even narratively, it's like you wouldn't want to give these kind of powers at will, like not at will, but like X times a day to a character if you're writing a book, because they're the kind of powers that make the audience go, well, why don't you do this all the time? And the difference
becomes
is
really
that when
hard.
it happens when you're playing D&D, the player has a lot of time to think about what to do. And so unlike the author, who can kind of like hand wave that and just write maybe a story that isn't very consistent, the player just goes like, well, I will do it. And then instead you get a boring story where the player can do whatever they want, and the dungeon master has to kind of cater to their godlike wishes.
Yeah, D&D becomes really hard to run and to balance properly at high levels, because of that, because like you have fighters who can attack 4 times. This is the classic meme, but the fighter can attack 4 times a turn now. All right, pretty easy to deal with that, in terms of like still having your story have stakes and everything makes sense. But the wizard can reshape the laws of reality, and it's kind of really hard to fight that power and to truly challenge a character like that. So, and those 20 levels, that's also just an old D&D thing. D&D only used to go up to like level, I can't remember. I didn't play back then, but my dad did. It used to only go up to like level, I don't know, 10 or something, and then they came out with all 20 levels. There was a time when you could level infinitely as well. Anyways, these all are just weird things that kind of have to do with the legacy of the game. But if you look into the nitty-gritty of the design of D&D, you can find that they expect you to only play till 12th level-ish. They know that the vast majority of players only play until 12th level. So you have to imagine about 50% of the content in the player's handbook, maybe only a third, but a substantial chunk of the content in the player's handbook is literally not designed to be played. It's just kind of designed to look cool, give you something to aspire towards. So yeah, anyways, before we just go off into a diatribe of criticizing elements of D&D, it's like, fantasy is really fun, tactical combat is really fun, playing RPGs with your friends is really fun, but sometimes D&D can kind of weirdly be annoying, overly complicated, standing in your way when you don't need it to, rules for things you don't really want rules for, rules missing for things you really do want rules for. Things like that can happen, and I find it often has to do with this sort of design ethos of D&D. So, why are we mentioning this? Because Draw Steel has a very different design ethos. They have 4 design goals that they've put out right from the start. Thea, can you tell us what they are?
Yes. So, as I alluded to in the intro, Draw Steel has 4 kind of keywords that it aims to achieve. It's a cinematic game. So it wants to create it wants to be a system that allows the players to describe cinematically the cinematic actions that player characters take, instead of being kind of like a physics simulator, which accurately describes reality. It wants to create the impression of heroic action. And I think a lot of that will come through during the combat that you will get in the following episodes. Not to spoil, but about how certain mechanics with minions work, for example, allowed me to just kind of describe how does my character kill that guy over there without any mechanical explanation other than the guy's dead. Describe how. And then there is the tactical element. So This game is very this really goes into the nitty gritty of the rules and provides a very simple framework, a concept of a power roll, to create a very dynamic and kind of deep system with small set of moving parts that all interact with each other a lot. And
Yeah.
that's why combat was really slow the first time we tried it, because we were keeping track of all these things. But I did
Although I
have the
will point
impression that it
out,
gets, yeah,
at the end of the day, the combat was about an hour long or an hour and a half. Um, which is like in
really.
D&D terms. Yeah, I know. It's crazy because it takes us like 30 minutes to take each of us our first turn, but after that it gets a lot faster. I've been editing the episode today, so that's why I know it in such detail. But
All
yeah,
right.
it's actually but yeah, you're right. I mean, obviously it is a hard, like any TTRPG of the level of complexity of D&D or Draw Steel. The tactical nature of it can be hard to pick up at first, but yeah, the whole point of this tactical pillar is tactics matter, right?
Yeah.
Positioning matters, teamwork matters. You know, in this game, you can decide. There's a lot of options in this game that matter, and that's something that I find very refreshing because in D&D, you often get the feeling that there's a lot of options, but then it turns out most of them don't matter. What I mean
Yeah.
by that is, oh, you could pick any number of first level wizard spells, but you're going to pick Find Familiar and you're going to pick Shield, right? And then you're going to pick something that deals damage. And you're probably going to pick Detect Magic, and you're probably going to pick Identify. So, of those 6 first level spells that you get as a wizard, lots of them are just kind of a gimme. Yeah, you can pick the worst spells if you want to not be able to do as cool stuff. Sure. But that's not really a meaningful decision in my mind. That's not a meaningful tactical decision, right? This game has a lot of that. You know, this idea of positioning matters, who goes when matters, your choice of power matters. But it's better balanced, I find, in a lot of ways than D&D because it can give up some of the core concepts that make D&D unbalanced. So we had tactical, we had cinematic.
Yeah. It's also a heroic game. I feel like this
Mm-hmm.
has less to do with like the mechanical implementation of the game and more like with the writing of like what the races, what the lineages are, and what the classes and their powers do. But like generally, the game assumes like the flavor of the game is that you are a hero trying to do good things. The game can be played otherwise, but like the type of monsters presented and the type of classes presented seem to kind of assume that you are generally trying to do something good.
Yeah. And I would add on to that, they also interpret hero as incapable. And I do find that that goes into the mechanics, right? So they say, right, you never miss an attack in Draw Steel. You never have attacks that deal 0 damage. If you use your power roll to roll an attack, even the tier 1 result will deal damage. And the idea is like, you know, when Aragorn wades into combat with orcs, he never misses. You know, maybe he hits one orc better or he hits the orc worse, right? But generally, you're assumed to be so capable that you don't have these sort of blanked turns, that you don't have to spend a turn missing an attack. It also has to
Yeah.
do with the financial side. The game doesn't really have a gold system because the assumption is why, you know, in D&D for a long time it was like, well, why would you help? And originally it was this concept of the gilded hole, right? The idea that this gold is why you would, that's why you would do anything. You were fully self-interested. And this game assumes, no, you're helping people because it's, I mean, as a player, because it's fun, and because as a character, it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
All right, fantasy. Define fantasy
Fantasy.
for us, Thea.
Oh boy. Merriam-Webster's dictionary. Fantasy is difficult. Well, I mean, we all have kind of an idea of what fantasy is. This
Yeah.
game goes for a type of fantasy that is a little bit less your traditional Tolkien fantasy and a lot more your like pulp action adventure fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
There are other planes with alien type humanoids made of silicon that live by the laws of order
Yeah.
in a way that is more reminiscent of lineages like the Vulcans
Mm-hmm.
from Star Trek. There is dragon knights that are draconic people who have been created by a good King Omen, if I remember
Yeah. Yeah.
correctly.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And you also have your elves, but you also have these halfling type creature who are a lot more dark and shadow oriented. You have
Mm-hmm.
half giants. You have your dwarves. So this fantasy is not trying to be your bread and butter like Tolkienian fantasy. type of fantasy. I think it is still quite close to D&D fantasy because you
Yeah.
have your dragon people, you have all these weird
Yeah,
things.
you have your dragon people, your devil people, your elves, your
Yeah,
dwarves.
you
It's like
have
most of the stuff in the
psionics, which is
player's handbook.
separate. Yeah, you have psionics, which is clearly separate from magic. So
Yeah.
there's mind powers,
Yeah.
as God intended.
Yeah,
And so,
as they are in D&D.
exactly.
Um
So there is the fantasy element, obviously, is very much there, but
By the
I
way,
feel
I
like,
caught you in the Edge of Extinction recap episode referring to psionics as magic. So,
well,
booyah.
well, we all make mistakes, and I'm mature enough to admit it. Why aren't you?
Ugh, psionics is a mistake. But more on that in some other episode.
Someone
So,
someone has a hard time admitting their mistakes.
um, so yeah, no, I agree with you. Right, fantasy is hard to define, but everybody knows what it is, right? And it's not really that important to the design beyond the fact that like the mechanics of the game assume give you sort of powers you would not be surprised to find in a like pulp fantasy novel. You know, shooting fireballs, predicting the future, you know, melding into shadows, to being really strong or really fast. You know, stuff like that. Okay, so that's just point one. Basically, we're going to work from broad to specific in this game, going over a few things that make it different from D&D and that make it interesting to me. So yeah, that's the first one, the design goals. Draw Steel has a really clear idea of what it is and what it wants to be. It wants to be tactical, heroic, cinematic fantasy. It doesn't want to be anything else. And D&D I find is often a game that's like, well, it could be a dungeon delving game, like sorry, D&D 5th edition. It's like, oh, it could be a dungeon delving game, but it doesn't really fully work as a dungeon delving game because there's just spells that solve most of the problems in dungeons. And then it could be more of a heroic fantasy game, but then there's kind of weird things like natural ones and missing a lot of the time and, you know, issues like that. And then it feels like it's kind of trying to serve everything at
Yeah,
once
it's too
instead of
much of
being a
a
very
reality simulator to be a heroic fantasy story, like heroic
yeah.
fantasy telling medium, but it's also too much of a heroic fantasy storytelling medium to be an accurate reality simulator. So,
Yeah.
go
And
figure.
it has issues also with like the different pillars of the game, right? It's said that like in the Dungeon Master's Guide for 5th edition, it used to say, I don't know if it says it in the new one, but it used to say, oh, there's three pillars of the game, right? Combat, exploration, and social interaction. And it's
Fucking
like,
liars.
yeah, the rules for social interaction are at most one blurb describing how you can either speak in your character's voice or state what your character says. The persuasion, intimidation, and I don't know, like deception skill, and then one table. So like basically a rule set light enough to be printed on one A4 page of paper. So the social interaction system, in quotation marks, system in D&D is about as complicated as roll for shoes, right? And then the exploration system is about as complicated as like, you know, I don't know, a 10-page rules light, you know, basically mostly you make it up game. And then the combat system is like 500 pages of content. So like, you know what I mean? It's like um, you could use it as a social interaction game, but it's never going to have the sophistication that a game dedicated to social interaction is going to have. It could be an exploration game, but it's never going to have the sophistication that a game dedicated to exploration is going to have. And it could be kind of a combat game, but is then oddly held back at times by some of
Yeah,
the rules it has that are established for to serve the other pillars.
yeah, and there's like an element to it, like all the content for the game is also clearly designed a lot more for combat.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of spells and abilities that are useful in combat. And not only they're useful in combat, but they interact with the rules of combat. For
Mm.
example, to make a counterexample, there is a very stupid and simple system in the old DMG, Dungeon Master's Guide, for social interaction, which is every character that you start kind of a social interaction with has either a positive, a neutral, or a negative stance towards you. And
Mm.
that's supposed to kind of influence how much you can get out of a successful persuasion roll out of them, correct?
Mm.
Yeah. So there isn't a single spell or ability that references this. There isn't a
Yeah.
single ability that is like you can treat the stance of the NPC as one better than it is because you are an
Yeah.
eloquence bard. You know, instead it's always you can do this as a bonus action instead of an action because that's really what the game is about.
Yeah.
Like,
I think you're totally right. And that's another thing that's interesting about D&D is D&D doesn't have a lot of subsystems. It just has a lot of exceptions. Like there's not one universal damage bonus. Like Hex and Hunter's Mark and Divine Favor all work similarly, but not quite the same, as well as the Ranger Monster Slayer ability. All of these abilities give you a damage bonus on weapon attacks against certain targets, but they all work slightly differently, right? Same thing with dark vision, right? Dark vision is always 60 feet unless it's 120 feet, unless it's 300 feet, you know? So there's like not one consistent dark vision rule. There's not, so there's not like a lot of consistent subsystems that then get referenced unless it's like action economy in the magic system, like spell slot level that often gets referenced, you know? And like action economy often gets referenced, but there's a lot of elements of the game that aren't like that in Draw Steel
mhm.
that, where there's like just like no subsystem and like, but we'll get to that with Draw Steel. All right, so we've talked enough about that. The next thing that differentiates these games, I think in a really interesting way, I even think I could do a whole episode on this, is the power roll. So in Draw Steel, to serve the heroic narrative, there's a power roll. You roll 2d10 and add them together and add your relevant attributes. And then there's basically a tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 result way of interpreting your roll. So if you roll below an 11 or an 11 or below, then that's tier 1. If you roll 12 to 16, that's tier 2. And if you roll 17 and above, that's tier 3. So when you attack in this game, you roll your power roll, right? And then you deal as much damage as the tier 1 result says that you do. So you don't roll to attack and then roll damage. The damage is fixed based on how good the attack roll is, and even tier 1 deals damage. Whereas D&D uses just a flat D20 roll. And so I don't know. I just think the power roll is cool, right? It's more consistent because the distribution of the values trends towards a middle value. If you're completely uninitiated in statistics, when you roll two random distributions, um, even if they're both uniform distributions, they become a pyramid distribution where the center value becomes the most likely. So the most likely roll with 2d6 is a 7. The most likely roll with 2d10 is an 11. And then extreme rolls are less likely. So it kind of creates an approximation of some kind of bell curve or some kind of distribution where there's certain values in the middle that are common to be expected and certain values on the edges that are rare, that are unexpected. In D&D, we all know that natural 20 is just as likely as that natural 1, which I do think is sometimes grating for me personally. It's like some people like the swinginess, but I find it often too swingy. You know, sometimes professionals fail when they shouldn't, in my mind, in D&D, and novices succeed when they don't deserve to. And that naturally makes a game more tactical, right? When your bonuses matter more and your choices in getting yourself modifiers for the roll matter more. But it also has way less variance because every roll only has 3 outcomes. And so there's a universal language for success that goes throughout the entire game. Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3. In D&D, there are some mechanics that sometimes try to reference like success by a certain amount. Like there's a lot of homebrew that's like, oh, if you succeed by 5 or if you fail by 5. But in general, in D&D, it's just a pass-fail system. And so the power roll kind of gives you an elegant measure for success and for standard measures of difficulty, right? Because basically, if you want to make an easy roll, you say, okay, tier 1 is success with a consequence, tier 2 is a success, and tier 3 is a success with a benefit, for example, right? This is a really easy check then, but you could just swap out the elements of the table. I could make a check that's really sucks when you fail it and is really rewarding when you succeed it. Or I could make one where the best thing you can get is a success with a consequence. In D&D, there's like no universal framework for that kind of thing. So I really think this table design is really interesting because I see it more and more in games where it's like roll and then consult this table that breaks it down into 3 possible outcomes instead of like 20 possible outcomes.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, your example with like the natural 1 and the natural 20 being equally likely is is kind of a bad example, because those will still be equally likely in a pyramid distribution, like the two
Okay.
extremes of the pyramid. But yeah, I know what you mean. Like the thing is that like the average outcome should be a lot more likely, because
Yeah.
then your bonuses matter more.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
that's
it's
kind
like
of what we ended
basically,
up implementing in our D&D game after all. Like right now it's optional in our
yeah.
game that you can roll with 2d10s instead of a d20. And that's
Yeah.
what I'm doing.
I like to do that for the monsters in the game. So kind of the players tend to roll with d20s, and then I, as the DM, I like to roll with 2d10s. And the reason is that I like it when the monsters are consistent, and then the heroes can surprise you. It makes sense to me that I want the players to be able to think, look, this monster is rolling 2d10. They're probably going to roll an 11 or something like it, right? And then think about what's their modifier, and then try to adjust their expectations, sort of based on that. And then the players can kind of be wild cards. So it used to be in the old grappling rules for D&D, you would get a lot of moments where it's like, oh, I rolled a 12 and I have plus 12 to grapple, so 24. And it's like, sorry, they rolled a natural 20 and they have a plus 5. And it's like, God damn it. So I like it when the variance comes more from the players than it does from the monsters. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I guess what I meant also with the example of the natural 1 and the natural 20. So, on the one hand, what's most likely for a hero to roll? Probably an average performance. But the second most likely thing should be a stellar performance. And a really crappy performance should be unlikely, right? Like, I prefer a world in which the ability to crit and the ability to fumble are not the same percentage, where
Mhm.
the odds that you crit should be higher than the odds that you fumble, because you shouldn't really fumble. You know what I mean? Like a well trained fighter doesn't regularly fumble attacks. That just doesn't feel heroic or interesting to me. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that feels more like it comes out of a comedy beat
Yeah,
of something like, like the big guy, like, yeah, or a Marvel movie.
yeah, exactly. And even in Marvel movies, right? The failures of characters are very carefully timed, and are generally, you have sort of, I mean, you know, some Marvel movies do it better, some do it worse, but generally you time the
Doctor Strange.
comedic beat you time the comedic beats for when they don't matter, right? And you time the serious beats for the moments that do matter, right? And so it's like, when we're in the middle of the big fight and the music is swelling, that's not when Hulk does the puny god moment. He does the puny god moment at the end of the fight, when the fight is kind of already resolved and it's funny, but the stakes have been lowered again, right? And so D&D, you have this awkwardness where sometimes you're fighting the great evil lich who stole your mother, and you're trying to defeat them to save your mother's soul, and you roll a natural 1. And it's not that you can't fail and draw steel, but it's that the tier 1 result is at least still something. It's at least not ridiculous. And especially when I was growing up, there was a lot of critical fumble tables that were going around that made natural ones even more penalizing, because people really got wrapped up in this idea, well, a 1 should be the worst possible outcome that you could possibly imagine in a situation, and the 20, sort of reality simulator perspective, then the 20 has to be the best possible outcome. So I remember reading stories where somebody rolled a natural 20, and the DM like narrate at like level 3, and the DM like narrates their god coming down to do them a favor, right? Because they're like, well, what could the best possible outcome of this roll be? Well, it's a natural 20. So your god comes up, and someone else rolls a natural 1, and like a demon comes up, and now the god and the demon are fighting, and then people just didn't show up next session. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's awful. It's just awful.
Yeah. And
One
so
time we have to do an episode on your Dungeons and Dragons villain origin story.
yeah, like I do, like, you're right. Yeah, and the natural 1 and like a natural 1 and a natural 20 are the same probability even with 2d10. But in draw steel there is no critical fumble. If you roll a 2, it's a 2. It's a tier 1 result. You know what I mean? But if you
Mhm.
roll a 19 or 20, it is a critical success. And crits are even sicker in draw steel than they are in Dungeons and Dragons, because you get a whole extra turn. Um, so, um, but yeah. Good point. All right, so draw
Thank you.
steal. So we have draw steal has a consistent vision of what it is and is not trying to appeal to everyone. Knows what its 4 pillars are. It has a basic role that is robust and does a lot of cool shit. Next, let's talk about abilities. So in draw steal, basically anything you can use in combat is formatted as an ability. And an ability basically will tell you like what kind of action economy it requires to use, if it requires a roll, and if it does require a roll, it'll have a little power roll table. It'll say, roll this power roll plus your might or whatever, and then it'll say what's the tier 1, the tier 2, and the tier 3 result outcome.
And I would like to
This
add, it has some very useful keywords.
Yes. Why don't you tell us about the keywords?
Yeah, the keywords, initially I saw them, I was like, wait, do I need these? They're like melee, ranged, strike, magic, psionic. And then when you start seeing magic and psionic, you're like, okay, I get it. Yeah, basically they're very useful because when you get to do stuff, when you get to apply bonuses to your attacks, when you get to counter other abilities, basically when abilities interact with other abilities or traits interact with other abilities, it becomes it becomes so useful that instead of having to give some specific descriptions like in D&D, like, oh, it needs to have a an
It needs to have the
attack, like
word
an attack
magically in it
roll. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
for it
yeah,
to be
exactly.
magic, right?
Yeah,
There used to be all
exactly.
these questions people would have are like, is the vampire's charm ability magical, right? Or
Exactly.
like, because it's supernatural, it's not something that exists on Earth, but does that mean it's explicitly magical, right? You can have supernatural forces that are not magic. Similarly, is a dragon's fire breath, is that magic? Or is
Yeah.
that supernatural but part of the conceit of this fantasy world? Like in this
Yeah.
fantasy world, that is following the laws of physics.
Yeah, so exactly. Thank you. Those are great examples. And those keywords really made it easier to just describe, okay, this thing applies to abilities with the property melee and strike. Or
Yeah,
this applies only to abilities that have the property magic.
yeah.
And yeah,
So
so good.
yeah, I totally agree. The keyword system is something I find very useful for checking if certain things apply. One thing we had in Edge of Extinction, Idarian had Hex and Magic Missile from a low level, and so he would cast Magic Missile on creatures that he'd hexed. And I was thinking, oh, I'm shooting them once with each dart, and Hex gives you plus 1d6 damage on each attack. So I should get, I shoot 3 darts, and so I get the damage of the dart plus the 1d6 each time. It seems like a great combo. But Magic Missile isn't an attack because there's no attack roll. And so you kind of need to know that. That's just like specialized information. It doesn't say anywhere in the Magic Missile spell, this is not an attack. And in all the spells like Scorching Ray that do count as an attack, it doesn't say this is an attack, right? Anywhere. You just kind of have to know, oh, if I'm making an attack roll, it means that this is an attack, right? And if I'm not making an attack roll, which is the special thing about Magic Missiles, it doesn't use an attack roll, it just hits, then I'm not using an attack, And in this game, you would just see immediately. You'd look at the keywords of the ability and immediately know, does it apply? In D&D, there was also for a long time this thing where it's like, there's so many things where you're like, oh, I want to use this cool smite as a monk. And in the old rules, you couldn't because it said when you make a attack with a weapon, not a weapon attack. And so in D&D, unarmed strikes are weapon attacks, but they're not attacks with a weapon. And so if you don't know these nuances, you might think that you get to Divine Smite as a monk with your fists, but you don't. At least you didn't used to. They changed it now in the new rules, but it's still confusing at times, right? And so I thought the keywords are a really great way to just straighten out what abilities interact with which one, right? If it doesn't
Yeah.
say strike, it doesn't get the bonus. If it doesn't
Yeah.
say magic, it doesn't get the bonus. Is this
Yeah.
ability psionic? Well, if it has the psionic keyword, yes. Otherwise, no.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the ability format just feels great to me because it creates a consistent, coherent subsystem in the game for how things work. There's tags that tell you which abilities interact with each other. You know that everything is an ability, so everything's kind of formatted the same way, and it all works sort of in a way that you expect. For example, sometimes like you can use the magic action to cast a spell, or you can use an attack. You can use an action to attack, and then like it's like, oh well, I cast a spell, so then I can't use my bonus action to attack because I can only use my bonus action to attack if I use my action to attack, and everything just kind of works differently, and everything is kind of formulated differently. And it's like, oh well, when you're playing a monster, they have the multi-attack action, which is not the same as attacking with the attack action, and then for receiving extra attacks. And so there's just like, in D&D, there's just 17 different formats for how an ability can work. In Draw Steel, there's one concise format with tags and everything that explains how things work.
Yeah, like you have to understand the general framework in Draw Steel, and then you read the specific ability, but you don't have to figure anything else out.
Yeah.
Well, in D&D, you have to really like be a lawyer.
And I think that's the thing, right? I think D&D is like wants to appear simple and then have depth once you go through it. I much prefer the approach of Draw Steel with being like, okay, here's a little bit of structure up front, here's a subsystem up front, but it's going to make your whole life simpler after that. It feels almost like the more responsible option, like when people don't really want to admit how much work it is to organize a rule system. So they're like, no, it's real simple. It's just like this, right? And they try to have a really low overhead subsystem that kind of tries to handle every single situation instead of having subsystems with a little bit more rigor. And then once you get into the game, you quickly run into issues where it's like, oh, but the flexible one-size-fits-all system has a lot of caveats and, exceptions to it.
Yeah.
Kind of like R in Python, but that's going to be not a reference to most of our audience.
Different episode.
Yeah, different episode. All right. I want to talk about kits, too. I really like kits. So I'm going to briefly talk about kits, and then you're going to talk about your experience playing with them and what you think of them. So kits are the way that Draw Steel handles equipment. Instead of equipment being kind of literal and explicit, such as, oh, I buy this sword for 10 gold pieces, and I buy that sword for 10 gold pieces, and the swords have certain statistics, and I wield one sword in this hand and one sword in that hand, and then when I wield them in a certain way, I can unlock the dual wield property, and I can dual wield with them, right? And it's sort of all that would be a very literal, explicit way to handle equipment. Instead, Draw Steel sort of has these kits where you just pick one kit, and the kit sets your armor and your attacks and basically everything according to sort of an archetype. So instead of having like a short sword, instead you would have a kit called Dual Wielder, right? And the idea of the Dual Wielder kit is that anybody who fits into the fantasy archetype of a dual wielder, they would take this kit. And it gives you lighter armor because you're like a little bit faster. That's the idea. You're a dual wielder, you're a little bit faster. And then you have this signature ability, that just gives you the dual wield thing. So they don't have to write a whole subsection into the rules about like, oh, if you are wielding weapons like this and you make an attack like this, then you get to dual wield. They just give you an ability, and that ability does what dual wielding does, sort of. And so kits really abstract equipment. Instead of getting into the nitty gritty, you can reflavor a lot of it. Like you can, in Dungeons and Dragons, technically, you can't dual wield rapiers, right? In Draw Steel, you could dual wield rapiers easily, right? You just take the dual wielder kit and say, oh yeah, and what does it look like? It looks like rapiers, right? Because rapier as itself doesn't have one specific stat block in this rule system. Rapier doesn't concretely mean anything. It's the dual wielder kit, and you get to make up all the fluff. So I say this because you used the dual wielder kit to dual wield rapiers. How was that?
That was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed how no matter which kit I picked, or at least, okay, let's be more specific. I like that I had multiple options for kits, and that I didn't feel like I had to pick the correct one. My class had both my classes that I played had kits that were proposed to me, and I ignored both.
Yeah,
because
and it was fine.
I had a design in mind for my first character, and then my second character was meant to be a little bit like, how do I complement my first character the best now?
Yeah.
And so for my first character, he was a heavy single target big damage dealer, a paladin type character, even though it's called differently in this game. Sensor.
Mm-hmm.
But so when I was done with that, I wanted to have a dual wielder because I thought that I would have to fight minions one by one. Didn't know the mechanics were differently, and the minions kind of share a health pool. But so my idea was I'm gonna make a character who can make as many attacks as possible. And
Yeah.
so I built him after that. I picked abilities that let me do that, and then I picked a kit that let me do that. And I
Yeah.
had a lot of fun with it.
And I think it's cool because the kits are also not ability score specific. So an issue you run into D&D a lot is it's like, oh, I want this guy to fight with a big hammer. And it's like, yeah, but big hammer is actually not the best weapon for my character build. And then, but even more than that, it can be like, oh, I want this guy to fight with a big hammer, but light armor, kind of like a Conan style. And it's like, that's never optimal in the rules. Like you have to be a very specific D&D build to pull that off. So often you could just come up with a really cool fantasy for a character and not be able to execute on it in D&D because the ability scores don't work out, right? So like if you want to play somebody who dual wields, right? But I don't know. So if you want to play somebody who like dual wield hand axes but is dexterous, it's like you literally can't do that without homebrewing, right? Which is fine. It's an easy homebrew, but there's just like there's this natural resistance in every part of the game um, to you just flexibly and freely choosing how you want to fight, how you want to use equipment. And I find it often is very complex too. Like, oh, you got to pick the right armor, and there's really only one right pick for the armor usually for your build, and there's only really one right pick for the weapon usually for your build, and you got to go through the table and you got to find it and you got to figure it out, and then you got to figure out if you have the gold for it and if you can afford it, and you pay the gold and now you're wearing it. And then you
Yeah.
get disarmed at one point, and now it's like, oh, I don't have my hand crossbow anymore. None of my features work, or whatever. You want to pick up you want to pick up the bad guy's axe and do something cool with it. And it's like, sorry, you can't do that. Technically, that axe, you're not proficient with it, or it uses strength and you're a dex build. Um, and I really
Yeah.
like how the abstracting of equipment makes it simple, flavorful, archetype oriented, and gives you more meaningful choices.
Yeah, I wanted to
I
say, like, how the thing that all the stuff that you just described,
Yeah,
how none of that is in Lord of the Rings?
exactly. Yeah, yeah, and I think it's like it just makes your life simpler. Like once you've done it, you don't really want to go back. You're like, yeah, no, I don't want to know the nitty gritty of what a leather piece of armor does for me. I just want there to be a cool kit that matches my archetype, that just pre-packages these things for me and gives them to me. I want to be, a knight in shining armor. I want to be able to pick a shining armor kit. I don't want to have to go through all the sort of rigmarole. So that's one of the things that I appreciate is that like um almost I think all of the kits, but I'll just say almost to hedge my bets, work with like might and agility, right? And there's not like this sort of divide, this sort of idea that like you can't be a dual wielder if you're a might based character. Or like dual wielding is just more optimal, for agility based characters or something like that. Um, so yeah, I really like their approach to equipment. I think it's very novel. It's something I haven't seen in any other game before. So that's one thing that stands out to me about the rules. Okay, well we've talked about a lot of the sort of basic subsystems of the game. Let's get into the character specific subsystems in this game. Let's talk about heroic resources and malice. So you remember heroic resources, right? You want to explain them for a second?
Yeah, every class has a unique heroic resource that is specific to the class, and the way to gain that class, the way to gain that resource, kind of informs the game style that the game is encouraging for that class. So, for
Mm,
example, the paladin has this ability where they can put a judgment on a creature, which is like tagging them, and then you get a lot of bonuses against that creature. And
yeah,
so your wrath is generated every time you attack that creature, every time that creature attacks you. So it kind of incentivizes this dual dynamic where you pick the biggest guy on the battlefield, mark them with your judgment, and then go ham on them.
yeah,
And then you have the the Shadow, which
Shadow.
is like the rogue, who
Mm.
is based on another resource called Surge, which every
No,
character
insight.
shares. No, sorry. Okay, the heroic action is called Insight,
Mm.
but there's another resource called the Surge, which every character has access to. So it's not
Yeah.
specific, but
It's like the default damage bonus of this game.
yeah,
You collect them and then you can spend them like points whenever you do an
yeah.
attack to deal extra
But
damage.
yeah, and all of the Shadow's ability basically are like, not all of them, but a lot of them are about collecting, doing cool stuff that lets you collect surges, and then using these surges. So you have these explosive attacks where you deal a lot
Mm.
of damage, or you inflict a condition, and by using a surge, you make the threshold to avoid a condition harder to bypass.
Yeah.
And so it encourages this very flashy combat style.
Yeah.
And also, all of the abilities that use up insight cost less if you gain advantage on the roll, which is to say, like flanking, for example.
Yeah. Like
Or
if
in
you
this
get an
game, it's
edge
called
on
an
the
edge.
roll.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So the
But I
game
like that.
also
I really like that.
incentivizes positioning and clever positioning.
One of the cool things about Draw Steel compared to like 3.5th edition D&D, like one of the big upgrades in D&D from 3.5th edition to 5th edition, because I played both, was advantage. Because in 3.5th edition, you got a lot of random +1s, +2s to certain types of rolls. And in 5th edition, a lot of those were taken out and just replaced with advantage. An advantage is just like a default accuracy bonus, right? And in a similar way, Draw Steel has a default power roll bonus, which is an edge, which is a +2, and then two of them just automatically upgrade your result by one tier. Similar to that, the default damage bonus. These are just, I mean, it's not on topic for heroic resources, but it just points to there are these inherent subsystems within the game where it's like when I want to give you a bonus to a roll, I don't just make something up for the occasion, like is often the case for D&D. Instead, I give you the specific standard default bonus for that. You get the default roll bonus, or you get the default damage bonus.
Yeah.
Yeah. Heroic.
So these are very cool. This is a very cool thing that every class is basically structured the same way.
Yeah. I really like that. Yeah, in D&D, one of the issues you have is that basically the spellcasting system is quite powerful, and so having access to it is kind of essential for a class to be very good. And
Especially at higher
so
levels.
especially at higher levels. So classes that just don't get access to the spellcasting subsystem, they kind of just don't compete, right? In this game, it's not like that, right? Spells are also abilities, and they are paid for with heroic resources. So the design, the subsystem is basically the same, whether or not you're a fighter using Uber Duber Smite, or you're a mage using Uber Duber Spell. It's an ability that costs heroic resources, right? It's not like two completely different subsystems. The game reuses its own subsystems to make that happen. What I really like about heroic resources myself is how they naturally make combat build up. One of the issues I have with D&D is I find it's often all or nothing. You can either cast Fireball or you cannot, and you know it ahead of time. I feel like that can be frustrating at times, upsetting at times, like, I'm not sure we're going to win this fight because I know I can't cast Fireball anymore. Or like, damn, I wish I hadn't spent my spell slot. Now I can't cast Fireball anymore. In this game, it's all a maybe. It's like, well, given enough time, saving, as long as you fight through a longer fight and you save up your heroic resources, you can eventually cast Fireball, right? So instead of being
It's like
like,
I can build my way up to a fireball if I play my cards right in this combat.
yeah, you can work your way up to a Fireball, exactly. Um, Instead of it just being sort of pre-decided for you, you can use it or you cannot use it. And it's really cool and cinematic when your abilities build up in combat. It's something we make fun of in movies all the time. Like, hey, Optimus Prime, why didn't you start with the sword? But it is a standard component of narrative storytelling that, especially heroic storytelling, that characters get stronger as time goes on. And so starting the fight and being like, uh-oh, we're in trouble, but then charging up towards the end and doing your big attack on like turn 3 makes you feel really awesome, makes you feel like you've built your way up to something. You've gotten into the flow, you've gotten into the swing of things, and like your
Yeah, the
character is
fight doesn't
living
start with
emotion.
Iron Man. The fight doesn't start with Iron Man using the 2 laser thingies
Yeah.
immediately, taking out most of the enemies, and then pulling out like a pocket knife and stabbing his way through the rest.
And being like, yeah, all right, this is all I have left now, so let me use this. Yeah, that's much more, anticlimactic. Otherwise, whereas with the heroic resources, you can build up to the system. And it's also cool because in D&D, often the issue with marshals not being as entertaining is they don't really have a resource to manage. It's fun in this game that everybody has a resource to manage. Everybody has something to play around with. Whereas in D&D, it's often like, it's not even that it's necessarily weak, though it often is. It's just that it's boring sometimes to be a marshal where it's like, oh, I attacked twice. Here's my thing. My turn comes around, I attack twice. And then I always use my bonus action to make my offhand attack. And that's just every single one of my turns looks the same. It's the same. It's the same algorithm every time. Whereas in this game, I find it's much more flexible. Everybody, yes, also the spellcasters, but even the marshals get to sort of. There's not really any divide. They're both classes build the same way, and both classes get to play around with the resource and save up for stuff. You know who even more so gets to make interesting choices who didn't before in D&D?
The Dungeon Master?
Yes, the
Or
director, as it's
the
called in this
director.
game. Yes. So in this game, the monsters have kind of their own heroic resource called malice, and the amount of malice you get is equal to the number is based on like a table with the number of players plus 1 for every round of the combat. So it's the number of players plus the number of victories those players have divided by 2 plus then the number of rounds that combat has been going. So 1 for round 1, and then round 2, and then round 3, keeps going up. So you have this resource that you get to spend, and I have to say, combat is really interesting and really fun as a director in this game, because in D&D, you don't get to choose when your creatures go. They go in initiative order, and most of them don't have charged abilities, and if they do have charged abilities, you should immediately use them until you cannot anymore. And so there's a very, very simple algorithm to running monsters at, let's say, 90% efficiency in D&D, which is, well, they go when you have to go. The stat block normally makes it obvious which action you should use, and any charged abilities you should use as soon as possible because you may die, right? And that's it. But in this game, instead, you get to choose when your monsters go. So, the players and you cycle back and forth, but you get to choose when the monsters go, and you get to choose when you use your malice. You can save it up, use a little every turn, use a burst, and then a little, it's all up to you. But it's really cool that you get to make those kinds of strategic decisions. I found that very enjoyable and rewarding. And the fact that the malice keeps building up really keeps fights tense. Like, even when most of the monsters are dead, you still have that's the point of time when you start to generate a ton of malice and can do really out of control stuff. In D&D, it's often like, round 1 and 2 are exciting, round 3 is a little bit not as exciting because you kind of know the fight is won. That doesn't really happen in this game as much because that's when they have all the malice banked up.
Yeah, it was difficult to predict, kind of like when you would do what. And exactly, it's difficult. There was a little bit of, I must admit, coming from D&D, there was a little bit of a frustrating component to it. Where it's like, I keep chopping enemies down, but the battle isn't getting any easier. And it's not just from D&D. I think it's also just like from video games in general, because this is how video games tend to work. Yeah, there's two big guys and then a bunch of minions, and I took one of the big guys out, so now it's easier. And then in the within the framework of Draw Steel, the answer is no, it's not easier. Actually, it's harder now. It's like, what do you mean?
Well, maybe not harder, but or equal, depending on the circumstance. But definitely, it's not as much of a... It behaves more like video game boss fights than video game standard fights. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And it's odd that they all kind of work like this. I do wonder, I do wonder if you'd get used to this and just be like, at some point, this is normal. Or if we'd still feel weird about it, because there is merit, I think, still. Like, I don't want to go entirely away from the simulationist
Mm.
argument. There is a place for realism, so that it allows you to get invested in the story. Like, a lot
Yeah, I
of
mean,
bad
like being
story
able to
follow this. A lot
predict.
of bad story follow this trend of, like, you always build up more and more power during the fight. And I think it's a pitfall that a lot of stories fall into, where they don't justify well enough. Why didn't you do this before? Why didn't the
Yeah.
character just do that from the beginning if they could do this the whole time? Like, that is a pitfall of bad storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this game, right, the idea is that the needs of the game go over the needs of the narrative, and that it represents like confidence and teamwork, and getting warmed up to something and getting that adrenaline rush and stuff like that. But and since a lot of abilities are sort of magical in nature, it helps to not be. It's never like, and now I pull out my giant gun, and it's like, wait, this guy had a giant gun the whole time. Why didn't you pull it out earlier? It's more like, oh, now I do the heroic smash. And it's like, well, why did this guy not do the full body smash at the start of the fight? Yeah, he didn't get the opportunity. He wasn't warmed up yet.
Yeah.
But I know I hear what you're saying, and I think especially what Malice adds is a big element of unpredictability to what enemies are going to do. There is something satisfying when you know what enemies are going to do, to be able to plan around it and work with it more. D&D
Yeah.
is much more a game, I think, where you can outsmart your enemies and get them into a position where they can't really do anything to defend themselves anymore, and you've kind of won the fight by default. And I think that doesn't exist as much in Draw Steel, because enemies are just more flexible and more wily than that.
Yeah. There
Because they
is.
have
Yeah, I
things
think.
like
I think to
Malice.
be fair, there is the uniqueness of our experience with Draw Steel, where you put me immediately in a boss fight. So my one and
Yeah.
only experience is with the boss monster that pulled out a new kind of bullshit every turn.
Yeah, that's
So
true.
if we had been fighting goblins for like 3 sessions, I think I might
Yeah,
feel differently about it. Because, like,
yeah,
eventually it's like, okay, I have a feeling for what goblins do.
yeah. All right, let's talk about. I mean, guys, just so you know, the Draw Steel playtest rules are about 600 pages right now. Draw Steel comes out in about 6 months, so we're not going to get into the full detail of everything that we think is interesting to talk about. But I think a last interesting thing to talk about would be the action economy, just because I think this is a failing of D&D as well, and that appears to be kind of the theme of this episode. Um, so the
Mm-hmm.
action economy in Draw Steel is actually extremely similar to the action economy of D&D, and yet at the same time, infinitely better. In Draw Steel, you have an action, you have a move, you have a maneuver, which behaves a lot like a bonus action. So 5e aficionados, you may be noticing a theme here. And then it has a triggered action, which works almost exactly how a D&D reaction works.
And then there's free
Um,
triggered actions.
yeah, and then there's basically free versions of all of these. So there's like free maneuvers, free triggered actions, free actions. And those are all, as the name implies, free. You don't track those. You just. So, and I mean, the same way that D&D has like free object interactions,
Mm-hmm.
basically that's kind of how they work. Or how D&D just has things that just sometimes don't cost action economy. It's just like, when you attack, you can do this. And it doesn't, like a smite in the old rules was like, when you attack or when you deal damage, you can deal extra damage. And here they would say as like a free triggered action, probably you can deal extra damage, but it's just like requires no action economy explicitly. So with the action economy of these two games being so similar, what makes Draw Steel's action economy so much better? And the main thing is the design. The main issue, and I thought this was really interesting because I've been trying to build alternatives to 5e action economy for a long time. The main issue with 5e action economy is not the concept of an action, a bonus action, a reaction, and a movement. It's the fact that not all classes and builds inherently have one, which means that if you are in a class that takes advantage of their bonus action and someone else is in a class that doesn't take advantage of their bonus action and they don't have any other features that take advantage of their bonus action, person one just gets to do more every turn.
Or, to be fair, person 2 gets to get a feat that lets him get to do a cool bonus action that person A couldn't.
Yeah. So the point is you have to find one, right? You
Mm-hmm.
have to find a worthwhile bonus. And when you're building a character in D&D, you need to find, I mean, play D&D how you want. But if you want to build something that's strong, you generally are obligated to find yourself a bonus action, find yourself a reaction, find yourself a good action. That one's obviously the easiest that you're doing every single turn. So, for example, if you were a wizard, you'd be like, oh, make sure to take shield. Shield is a great reaction spell. You're not using your reaction for anything else. So make sure to grab shield. It's basically free. And then you probably want to grab something as a bonus action, right? Some bonus action spell or something like that. Misty Step, great choice, right? That's why often wizards at low level have Misty Step, Scorching Ray, and Shield, right? Bonus action, reaction, right? And as a fighter, right, you would be like, okay, you probably want to maybe you can cast Hex as a bonus action through a feat, or maybe you want to dual wield, or you want to take that feat that lets you shove people with your shield, but you're generally going to want to find something you can do as a bonus action, and then you kind of, if you're in melee, then you're good, then the opportunity attacks are your reaction, and then attacking is your action, right? And if you don't know this, it's kind of like how ability scores work in D&D 5th edition. If you don't know how to do it, you can really screw yourself. It's kind of a very strange distribution. If you don't know anything, you can totally fuck yourself. And then there's just a certain, like, when you know how to assign them correctly, then everybody else is on an equal playing field. It's kind of like that with the action economy too. So the issue is just that there aren't default bonus actions that any class can take and any class can benefit from. That every class doesn't give you a default reaction that is interesting to use and is useful to use. And then the action is mostly covered in 5th edition D&D. So I think this point is interesting because there's just so little you need to change. You just need to slightly tweak your class design and give yourself a few standardized bonus actions. And then everything works. So in Draw Steel, the grab maneuver, which is like grappling, is a bonus action. The shove maneuver, or it's called knockback, but it's like shoving from D&D, is a bonus action. Healing yourself is a bonus action, or is a maneuver in Draw Steel, right? So there's lots of interesting things you can do with your maneuver. Similarly, disengaging is a thing in 5th edition. It takes your whole action to do it. In Draw Steel, it's a form of movement. So you just kind of have your movement, and then you can shift that amount, which is the same equivalent as disengaging in D&D. When I first looked into other kinds of games, I was very interested in how they handle action economy because I was very aware of the fact that it frustrates me that whenever I'm building a D&D character, there's just this winnowing process that takes the fantasy away from you, where it's like, well, I want to have a strong guy in light armor, but okay, I can't have that. All right, so I want a strong guy in heavy armor, but dual wielding, but that takes up my bonus action, and I'm a ranger. I need my bonus action. Okay, I'm not dual wielding then. So I'm a guy in heavy armor with a sword, but I'm a ranger. Rangers don't get heavy armor proficiency. Okay, I'm fucking playing the guy from the Forgotten Realms novels, all right? I'm Drist, all right? Fuck me. I don't get to play my concept, I guess,
Yeah.
And that doesn't exist here with the action economy. So, yeah, I don't know. Comments, thoughts?
Yeah, it was. I will say from my side, there's nothing I can say that I think you haven't already touched on. But from my side, the player's experience when I was building the characters, it was refreshing how little I had to worry about that. Like I was already overwhelmed by a lot of things, but one thing that didn't worry me was, is my character viable?
Yeah.
Because I felt like, okay, my ability scores are taken care of. Because they're given to me. You can't
fuck up on the ability scores.
I can't fuck up the ability scores because they're fixed. So the next thing is picking my abilities, and I have to pick one maneuver, and I have to pick from some actions. So essentially, I cannot not have a maneuver because they tell me pick a maneuver. Yeah. And that's very smart. And that made it very easy for me to build my characters, especially the one where I had a concept in mind. Mm-hmm. Because for that one, especially, I was not building for function. I was building for style. And I was keeping function in mind. but the game made sure that basically no matter what I built, it would be kind of viable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that's a great note to end on, or to start summarizing on. I think Draw Steel has a clear vision of what it is, effectively uses subsystems to create meaningful tactical choices without even being ultimately in the end that different from how D&D feels to play, just like with a lot of kinks worked out, you know?
Yeah. I read the rules once, like the core rules to how to play the game, and it worked. It was fine.
Yeah. Alrighty. I guess that does it for whatever this episode was. Our 13-minute diatribe on what we think Draw Steel does better than D&D. We're going to be releasing in a sequence of episodes the playtest that we played. I think it's going to be 3 episodes after this. So we're doing a 4-episode extravaganza on Draw Steel. You just finished part 1. Thank you for listening. Do you have any plugs? Yeah.
Yes, I do. I have watched a
Okay.
movie recently called Prey. It's in addition to the Predator saga from 2021, and it was a nice movie. It's a nice movie to put on an evening when you're tired. It's not horror. There is violence, of course, and gore, and there's a theme of hunting, so there's animal violence.
Yeah.
And it follows an Apache girl in the 1800s caught in a 3-way hunt with a predator and some French bison hunters.
Yeah.
And I thought it was really refreshing, considering that the Predator franchise hasn't been able to pump anything original out since the first movie. This one, I thought, was an interesting take.
That's nice.
Yes, I can't wait for the Terminator movie set with Native Americans.
Oh boy. I'm going to plug. I think it's on theme. I'm going to plug Daggerheart. Daggerheart is a game made by Darrington Press. It is very different from Draw Steel in its specific execution, but has a lot of the same incentive as to why it was made. It's a much more collaborative storytelling, somewhat more rules-light system, but it also, like Draw Steel, does not shy away from defining its own inherent coherent subsystems that it references over and over again with a uniform class design, and just a better implementation of many of the sort of rough edges for what it's trying to be. I think Daggerheart has a less clear vision than Draw Steel of what it's trying to be, and is in some ways less tactical, which to me is slightly less interesting. I'm also
It's almost
just
like it's
kind
not
of
designed by professional game designers.
Hey, it was in part. Their lead designer is definitely a professional game designer. Yeah, Matthew Mercer is a renowned DM, but not a professional game designer. But yeah, I think I'm a little sore also still just that Daggerheart had a really interesting action economy system in the playtest, and that's kind of been stripped out for the final version as far as I can tell, which is a bit unfortunate. But basically they had the system where you roll 2d12s, and one of them is the hope die and one of them is the fear die, and if hope is higher then you get a hope, and if fear is higher then you get a fear. And in combat, basically, as long as you kept rolling hope, your team, your side got to keep going, and in any order you wanted to. And it was kind of an action economy system where there was only the action. Like, there was no frills, no fluff. You had an action, and you got to do something. And every time you did something with your action, then the focus would pass. So it had kind of that thing that we talked about with board games when you were talking about Scythe, and I mentioned Ticket to Ride. It kind of has this thing where every turn is necessarily short because you can only do one thing per turn. And then as long as you kept rolling hope, your team got to keep going. As soon as you rolled with fear, the enemies got to go. So you never really knew how long.
Series,
Yeah,
this is a plug.
yeah,
There's an episode for this.
sure. You never really knew how long you would get to keep fighting for, right? You never knew when the tide was going to turn. I thought that was really great, and they kind of completely cut that out. But anyways, yes, it is true. This is but a plug, and that is it for episode 14 of the Friendly Orbit podcast. I hope that's the episode. I think that's what it is. You can find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as youtube.com/@afriendlyorbit. And if you want to get frisky, you can send us your astral echoes via email at afriendlyorbit@gmail.com. All one word.
Alright, Ceres, I'll talk to you later. And to all of our fellow Voyagers, we will catch you out there amongst the stars.